way back in the day, a little after my 7th birthday. My parents never wanted my brother and I to be glued to the TV set on a cooling summer's evening. It was a nice night out because the air didn't reek of cow waste and almonds for once. When it's all you're surrounded by, you'd think you would go nose blind to it. It only takes one breeze to remind you of its presence. My dad's the kind of guy who would never skip out on the opportunity to man the grill on a warm night with a cold beer in hand. I loved standing close and watching him work. The heat radiating off of the coals would warm my face, while a gentle wind's hand would give its cooling touch. I miss nights like this a lot. I used to like to stare down into the glowing red coals. Seeing all of the light and colours emanate out of them, I would quickly look up to the sky to let the coals' lingering impression on my retinas make the stars dance. A few seconds later, my vision would fade back to normal. My eyes were now focused directly above me. A handful of stars were all glowing so much brighter than the others. I rubbed my eyes, but they were still there, shining high. I peppered my dad with questions. I was an annoying kid. Sometimes they just do that, champ. Stars are big burning balls of fire, and it looks like God's got the gas cranked up on high tonight, he belched out, not taking his eyes off his chicken legs. Being 7, I took his word as gospel and left it at that. The rest of the night was normal. Dinner, clean-up family time, prayer, and then off to bed. My mum always handled the tucking us in bed duties. Dad had to wake up extra early to get started out on the ranch. I always rolled over after my mum shut my door. I liked to watch the drooping willow branches outside my window move with the wind. It blocked a little more than 2/3 of what I could see out of the window, so I had to learn to like it, whether I wanted to or not. Every window screen in the house was now equipped with extra tough window screens that only dimmed the view from the outside a little. There are a lot of stray cats on the property who are for the most part harmless. Sometimes, though, they used to rip right through the screens and piss and trash around the house. Not wanting to harm even God's peskiest of critters, Mum and Dad opted to install the extra thick and strong screens. From my bed, I could see out my little clearing of window to the distant sky. I could still see them. 6 stars in the paired and bright shining loud enough that all other stars in the sky were muted in their grace. They made me nervous. Remembering my dad's wisdom, I pulled up my covers and rolled over to fall into sleep. I've never been a very vivid dreamer. Sometimes I could remember a short flash of something, or if I was very blessed that night, I'd get a whole second or two I could recall for about half the day. Some of my worst nightmares never made it in my mind past lunchtime. I drifted off to sleep pretty quickly, always do. Flashes of dreams started sinking in the closer to sleep I fell. My breathing slowed and my body kept falling further. I fell from the deep black of sleep into the brightest white I had ever seen. It was cold and clinical. I knew I was in a horrid place. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. I could see his silhouettes around me, the dentist and his brothers. I could only look straight above me into the glowing, indifferent ball of light. It scorched its name into the back of my eyes. I wanted to look away. I wanted to cry. A helpless little part of me knew I was going to go blind. I could feel his awful rubbery gloved finger probe along my gums. I woke up like I did on any normal morning, with my dad knocking on my door to start getting up, and with my automatic request for just a few more minutes. I didn't get them. Once my brain kicked on, the panic thoughts came flooding into my tired head. Oh crap, I'm going to be blind. I'm going to have to get a dog and a cane. Lord Jesus, please don't take my sight. When I opened my now tear-filling eyes, I could see the dark of my room. The faint whispers of dawnlight were beginning to peek in through the window. To say I was relieved was an understatement. I was spared. For all of 40 seconds, I tossed my covers aside and got out of bed. The moment my feet greeted the rug, I felt yucky and wrong. I was zapped with such a vengeful wave of nausea that I thought my organs were to explode out of my mouth. I burst out of my room straight for the toilet. If the bathroom wasn't directly across the hall from my door, I would have painted the floorboards with the mostly digested remnants of last night's barbecue. After puking out half my body weight and flushing a couple of times, I didn't feel much better, only emptier. I went to rinse my mouth, instead of brushing, a choice that only led me back to that chair faster than I would realize. Millie Hun, are you okay? Mum was racing up the stairs. Half the world must have heard me vomit. I don't feel so good was as far as I got. I locked eyes with the crimson child in the mirror across me. My hand was still hanging on the mirror's handle. My arm was bright red, and I could feel the warmth radiating from it. I felt like a lizard that passed out under the heat lamp. My face was a dry, peeling mask of dead skin. I could see tiny pieces flake from my trembling, cracked lips. A scream rose from my throat faster than the vomit. My mum's confused scream quickly tagged along with it. "Millie, what on earth did you do?" "Mama, it hurts. I don't. I was as scared and lost as she was. She scooped me up and ran down the stairs. I got slathered in aloe vera and tossed in the truck with a sleeve of saltines to nibble on. On the drive out to our doctor, my shirt burned all over my sore body. The slightly too tight seatbelts made it hurt and itch with every bump on the road. My mum started looking as pukey as I felt. We made the drive in half the time. I don't know what exactly she told the doctor, or much of how she responded, only that this much damage couldn't have happened overnight, or it's a severe allergic reaction. She gave us two things, a prescription for some medicated lotion, and a skeptical look while telling us to call back if it ever happens again. The burns healed and time kept passing. We mostly forgot and moved on. A good few years had come and passed since my first bright dream. We still lived on the same piece of property together, well, for the most part. My brother, 6 years my senior, had just moved out into his first place after a lot of looking and whole heck of a lot of saving. I helped him load the last of his junk into the back of now his truck. "You think you're going to miss this place much?" I asked him, just trying to start some silence-ending chit-chat. "Am I going to miss what? The house? You mean fucking home? You know it. You can't not miss where you grow up, artard." It was the early 00s and his vocabulary was as of the time as his fashion sense. "It's gonna suck trying to feed myself, but you know what ain't gonna suck? No more pushing Jersey shit on my days off. No more hearing your sleep farts through the wall and finally not being frosted with frigging cat hair on all my clothes. That'll be something, I bet. You know, I think I miss this baby more than I'll miss you, if I do even. I always hoped I'd get to learn how to drive in her." I heaved the tailgate while I talked, trying not to let show how much I was actually going to miss having my big brother around. "Hell, Mill, never say never yet. Maybe next year I'll swing by and we can start leaning you something. Hop in real quick. I want to give you something." "On it," I said, already reaching for the passenger side handle. I got excited. Dale rarely gifted me anything, but when he did, it was always something awesome. Last time it was a super cool lighter that looked like a stack of dice. Time before that it was two little illegal-ish fireworks he says he got from his friend in Nevada. I used one with some friends to turn a jack-o'-lantern to atoms. I'm holding on to the second for something special. In my here hoodie pocket I have something for you that is very special to me. Now, I was a teen myself once. I did some dumb and I did some fun things. This beauty's a little bit of both. I was a little older than you, but close enough when I got this tizite piece. He pulled a gross little yellow-stained Ziploc baggie from out of his pocket. He had stars in his eyes. I had a little disappointed curiosity in mine. "What is it? I don't think I want to touch that." "Let me give you a quick whiff first, you'll love it." He spread the bag's flaps open, and the whole cab filled with a thick, horrible stink. He pointed the baggie at my face, and I saw what it held. I pinched my nose tight to look closer. Inside was a smaller, even more disgusting baggie that contained a small black silicone smoking pipe. At one point it looked like a black owl with big yellow eyes. Now it looks like a partially melted Halloween reject covered in burns and rosin from smokes long past. It was revolting and I was thrilled. "Gosh, Dale, I don't know what to say. Thank you, though. Hey, this ain't going to make me as dumb as you, is it?" "Hell, probably will. Stay in school, bud. Go to college." He took a huge, deep breath in and dropped his hand on my head. "If you squeal to Mum or Dad, or they find out in any way that I gave this to you, you are capital D Dunzo. Comprende?" He winked and tousled my hair a little too rough. "I copy, dude." I sealed the baggies and stashed it away in my jacket. We went inside to have one of our last dinners as the whole family unit for a little while. In my room, I could still smell the bag a little, so I flipped the fan in my window around to try and air out the room a little before the smell could latch onto anything in my room. I switched out the bags and made the genius decision to take it to school with me the next day. We didn't have a lot of money at the time, and getting a teenage girl a Nokia wasn't real high on the expense list. Communication had to be in person. I was paranoid about getting caught to boot. During passing period, I pulled my best friend into a stall with me to show her, and we formulated a plan for later that night. Sneaking out at 9 p.m. on a Thursday wouldn't be too difficult. My parents went to bed early and were some of the hardest sleepers on God's green earth. Her father never really noticed when she was coming and going. He worked a lot. Serena drove out to the ranch with her own small, smelly baggie. She managed to sweet-talk it off a senior at school who was constantly bugging her to hang out with him. It got old fast. I waited for her on the porch steps. A cat I had taken to calling Mercy saddled up to me for a few pets. She was pregnant and wanted a little comfort and warmth, I gave the little bald spot on her side a good pet to warm it up. I was happy to oblige. She pulled up 20 or so minutes later. We went straight to my room. Just below my window, overhanging the back porch, was an old but sturdy metal awning. I had been sitting on it for years as my little quiet spot. I had made a cut along the bottom and side of the screen for a way in and out. I had to replace the duct tape after every couple of times, but it held up well enough, except for a time or two that Mercy or another furry vagrant got through and sprayed all over like everything I own. We grabbed the comforter off of the bed to wrap around us, took down the fan and climbed out the window. We sat there, only a little nervous but super excited. The air felt electric that night. She offered a smell from her baggie, and I was a little hesitant, but not enough to say no. It did smell better. Still like the business end of an angry skunk, but better than where we were about to put it. We got started with the little knowledge we had. A few snacks, a comfy blanket, and a gorgeous starry sky above. I went first. I followed the instructions she gave me. With my lucky roller lighter in hand, I brought it to my face. Load, light, and inhale. Immediately I was convulsing in a coughing fit so violent I began drooling. I dropped the pipe and the ember burned a small through my shirt and burned my stomach a tiny bit. My throat scratched and burning. The coughing finally petered and I got my breath. Serena couldn't stop laughing. Guess I looked really funny to her. When my brain finally got oxygen again, I realized I was laughing too. I picked up everything real slow and passed it over. I felt numb and my head was spinny. I leaned back a little further to look up at the shimmering night sky. My eyes locked on the moon. She was a beautiful crescent, but not shining as bright as she usually was. It made me hungry for some reason. I was starving and reached down for the goldfish. I looked back up to the moon. She didn't look right and it bothered me. I scanned the sky for less than a second before my eyes locked on two gloriously bright stars. They were like the North Star's older brother in how loud and aggressive they shone. They were polluting the sky and dimming her light. It made me nervous. I grew so cold. It felt like they were seeing me. My heart started beating faster again as 4 more stars began to grow in brightness behind them. My stomach churned and I felt sick. I was swiftly yanked out my internalized panic by my friend's aggressive and dry coughing spasm. Her watering eyes caused me to feel a little sorry for her, and I patted her back a little too hard, causing the comforter to fall of our shoulders. We locked reddening eyes and could only giggle. I convinced myself I was just seeing things from the pot and forgot about it. I don't remember what time we went back inside, or when Serena left. I do remember putting the fan back and being so hungry and tired. I wanted to go downstairs for more snacks, but my sleepiness and laziness were both louder than the groaning in my stomach. I flopped onto bed and waited for the loving arms of sleep to whisk me off quiet. And so damn comfortable I laid there and felt it drifting in. The world faded into black and fell into dreams. I was walking down a sidewalk. The neighborhood was too dark to tell if I recognized it. Not a single house had their lights on. Not even the street lights were on. I couldn't see a little ways ahead. One end of the street curved upwards, bringing the houses with it. The other end stretched in the black of night. Scared and alone, I started walking towards the curve. I didn't get very far. The hairs on the back of neck stood high when I started picking up a soft buzzing in my ears. It grew in volume for a short moment before the street lamp above my head flashed to life. For a second I could make out all the houses around. They were all my house. I couldn't protect my eyes. They locked onto the oppressive white ball that bathed my whole body and the darkness around in its umbra. My eyes were now entered into a staring contest with this brilliant glow that I didn't plan on winning. I wanted to look away, but I don't think my body could. The world around me vanished and I felt weightless, like I was being pulled from the surface of dreams below me. The light starting gaining more illumination than it already contained. It was slowly getting closer, not brighter. I was being lifted towards the ball of light. Then it blinked at me. My ears were hurt by a yowl of pain, and hurt so great that I thought Judgment Day had come riding in on the throats of every animal on the land. The world went black and I shot out of bed less than a second after. My face was greeted by the semi-plush carpet. My legs hadn't gotten the notice to wake up quite just yet. In a sweaty, panicked scan, I surveyed the room. It was quiet. Surely the whole house had heard what I had, I thought, but the only sounds I could hear were my own labored breath and the whirring of the fan. The fan wasn't in its spot, but I could still hear it from the window, my wide-open window. The screen was in shredded ribbons. I stuck my head and was caught off guard with a putrid wind blown directly up my nostrils. The fan was hanging horizontally, blowing straight up. The cord was pulled taut and keeping the fan perpendicular to the wall. I grabbed the handle and plugged it. To this day, I still wish I hadn't, Jesus Christ. I dropped. No, I tossed the fan aside as a scream starting rise up my throat. The bile came up faster, though, and choked out the shriek before it could escape. Underneath was Mercy. Oh, God. The patch of missing fur was the only way I could tell. Her face was gone, and half of her intestines were laying out like wet, mostly deflated balloons. What happened to the kittens? The thought didn't last long. The noise from the fan finally died out and was replaced by the soft, wet gurgling that was leaking out a red froth from the perfectly triangular hole that used to be her face. I'm still ashamed that I threw up onto her. I didn't go back to sleep. I buried her out back in a shoebox and rocked myself in bed until sunrise. My mum knocked on my door not long after to wake up. I didn't change my clothes much. I walked out in an itchy, tired haze. I got in the car and waited for Mum, trying to convince myself that I just had a long, fucked-up nightmare. The dirt under my fingernails and burn in my muscles told me otherwise. "You all ready, baby? Don't want to forget nothing." She cut herself off, pinching her nose and shutting her eyes before she even sat in the car. Oh my God, I probably stink from last night. I'm so screwed. I thought quick, a new type of fear coming in. "Mill, you got inside and change right now. You reek of cat piss. Lord, it's making my eyes sting," she said, turning her head to look at me. Cat pee, I thought. I didn't smell anything, but I had an out. "I think Mercy got in my room again," I said weakly, trying to suppress the image in my head. I unbuckled, but my mum threw the car in reverse and started gunning down the drive path. Her eyes were wide and she had her shirt pulled up around her nose. "What are you doing? I was going to change." "We are going to the doctor, Millie. Did you not see your GD face?" She was real aggressive with her concern. "I'm okay, I'm just tired, nothing is wrong." I felt okay, maybe a little queasy and stressed, but okay. "You're not tired, you're beet red." It happened again, Mill. She turned the rear view at me and tried not to gag. My eyes met, and I saw peeling, pinking, and puffy skin. The longer I stared, the more I could feel it itch. I didn't want to scratch and cause a rainfall of dead skin. Mum threw up in her shirt a little. After a truckload of tests and an ointment prescription later, they sent us home with less answers and a lot less money than we had going in. Mum stayed sick for a long time after that. A week later, we got a call back. I now know that I didn't have an allergic reaction. I'm more prone to skin cancer and need to wear extra SPF sunscreen outside every day, and that I had concentrated levels of THC in my system. I thanked God that Mum didn't pick up the phone. I went upstairs to slather up in menthol and corticosteroid goodness. It tingled and stank, but the relief was worth the fumes. I had blisters almost everywhere. They stung and leaked for a week. One made its home on my collarbone that was the size of a pea and just as round. The sack was full and stretched tight. I know you're not supposed to pop them, but this fella was bugging me enough when just shirt brushed it. I was left with no choice. Safety pin in hand, I leaned into the mirror and gently pinched it in place. This gave me a soft shudder of hurt. It felt hot and greasy on my fingertips. I brought the pin up to it and started having second thoughts. I was hesitant. The pin was electrified in my fingers. They tingled and couldn't go the final millimeter, even though I knew I was putting force into it. I could feel my heart pounding in the blister. I was struck through with a lightning bolt of white-hot pain the instant pin touched sack. I yelped and couldn't move. A chorus of pain held my body paralyzed. The pain was a deep, hot needle I could feel straight through to my back. The tip of the pin didn't puncture skin. It started pulsating in my fingers, faster than my heartbeat. I managed to brace myself against the counter. It throbbed a sharp new hell when I caught my weight. My ears were ringing as the veins on my temples threatened a rupture. I couldn't move. Every breath was a grunting stab. My eyes locked on it in the mirror. It was nearly double in size as it burst open with disgusting damp pop. I shouted and started getting dizzy. It oozed clear, runny fluid down my chest. It glistened in the bathroom lights as it dripped onto the counter. It stopped weeping, and for a beautiful moment, it didn't hurt. Maybe that was just shock setting in. A staggeringly new pulse of pain and confusion struck me. There was a tiny hole in its center, my eyes fixed on it. An uneasy droplet of blood shot from it before a small, shiny silver ball birthed itself out. It tinked into the sink and down the drain. I passed out when my dad started pounding on the door. Years passed and a lot in life changed. I was now in my third year of college. For veterinary science and medicine, go figure. I was doing a couple of semesters out of state. My brother had talked me into taking the opportunity. As homesick as I was, I had made friends and even started dating. I'm thankful I wasn't far from home and alone. The trees were leafless at the end of November, right before the cold started gaining legs, and I was blessed with a week free from classes for the holiday. This road trip was an important one. My mum had been battling a lengthy stretch of leukemia, and after many rounds of chemo, she was in well enough health to celebrate her very favourite holiday, Thanksgiving. My brother moved back home when Mum got really sick. Dale would care for her when he knew Dad needed a rest, even though he would never admit it. He never left her side and made life for her as comfortable as the Lord would allow him to. I was nervous about this trip for another reason. It would be the first time any of my family gets to meet my girlfriend, at the time Danny. They had already heard everything about her well before we began to date, but meeting people in person can always be different, you know? We met studying at the same Starbucks. She thought my headphones were cute, and I liked her laptop stickers. We started studying next to each other and became friends. To best friends, to girlfriend and girlfriend. Things were going really well. 3/4 through our trip, we stopped at a gas station in Nevada to take a leak and fuel up. We were only a little behind, but still making good time. While looking around the sparse rows of junk food and soda, I saw the turnstile of name keychains. I started flipping through the D section like a madwoman while Danny was in the restroom. After too many Davids and Darrens and even a couple Dales, I found it. Danielle. She always disliked her full name, and we had that in common. It was one of the first things we bonded over. I was willing to waste a couple bucks on some light teasing. I walked out after paying to start filling the car. Keychain in hand, a bag of Fritos, 2 Red Bulls in the other, and 75 on pump 6. I finished filling the tank up, but Danny was still inside. The last drive through must have really hit her hard. She usually doesn't take this long, even after a greaseball lunch. A few minutes pass, and I saw her walk out of the gas station clasping her hands together with the biggest, goofiest grin I ever saw on her face. The closer she got to the car, the more I could hear her giggle. The way her muffled chuckles whistled through her chipped front tooth was one of my favourite sounds. "I found you a little something inside," she let out, composing herself a touch. Before I could say, "I got something for you too, cutie," she cleared her throat and unwove her fingers from each other to reveal an adorable little green man keychain. Well, it would have been adorable if it weren't for the big ugly letters ground into its surface. Mildred. For my little old lady, 'cause I think you're out of this world. She giggled out and kissed me on the forehead. My jaw hung half open in a grin. I was definitely surprised, but in a warm, happy way. I reached in my pocket and pulled her surprise. "I'm glad we're on the same page, Danielle." I snickered, presenting the keychain I got for her like I just snagged a huge fish. "Oh, you are such a bitch, I love you," she said playfully, punching my arm. "I love you too, asshole." We kissed and started out on the last leg of our road trip. We crossed state lines after several traffic jams had slowed us down considerably. There was still 10 hours left in our drive, and both of us were falling too tired to keep going. After a couple of swerves on the rumble strips and a few more exits, we chose to pool our remaining cash and get a room for the night. We would still make it tomorrow and a day early. We just need a little rest to get there. We got lucky and found ourselves at the Cozy Corner Comfort Lodge. We were exhausted and it was cheap. It was perfect. Danny checked us in, and I opted to stay outside and get some blood back into my legs. The cricket song, accompanied by the cool late-night breeze, made it real difficult to keep my eyes open. Even in the midst of stretching, the starry sky above was a nauseating beauty. It made the hairs on my neck stand high, but I still liked stare out. It was like the ocean to me, big, deep, and frightening. "So the guy behind the counter is 100% on something. He is big tweaking in there. I scored us a room, though," she had said with the barest hint of concern on her tongue. Half awake, I kinda just stared and nodded in response. We found our room and shambled into the stale-smelling but clean-enough-looking room. I tripped trying to get my shoes off, and Danny helped me into one of the 2 queen-sized beds. It was over for me the moment my head touched pillow. I hardly felt her climb in behind me as I began falling off the cliff into sleep. I was cold and walking through sparse woods alone. I could hear the noises of animals crunching through the flora around me. My breath was visible, but the condensation never dissipated and left a trail behind me. I was being guided by the shining light of 2 full moons above me. Where I was being led was a secret only they knew. I walked barefoot through my numb feet, trotting through muddy, leaf-covered ground, but my feet always came away from the surface clean. There was a break in the trees, and my foot came touch down on warm, dusty asphalt. It hurt the bottom of my feet, but was nicer compared to sharp, cold, wet mud. I found myself on a long stretch of highway, with trees lining both sides. My legs began walking on their own now, down the road towards the two voyeuristic moons ahead. They walked for hours, and I never grew any closer. The forest on either side of me never changed, like I was walking on rough, painful treadmill, except I was no longer walking. My legs were stiff and dangled above the yellow lines below. I was still moving forward. I felt the hairs on my neck raise as fear struck my every sense. Further down the road, I saw a pair of headlights coming fast towards. I tried to scream and thrash, but I couldn't move a single part of my body. I was trapped, paralyzed like a deer. The headlights weren't speeding towards me. I was drifting to them. They grew warmer the closer I got. Suddenly I felt the same heat beaming down from behind me. I couldn't turn back. I knew it was another pair of lights. I could see two shadows on the asphalt emanate from my body as I was lit up from behind. I tried to scream. I tried to cry. I couldn't even move my eyes. The light grew warmer and warmer as I got closer. Two more pairs of lights flicked onto life from between the trees. They kept pace with my floating form. Their light cut through the trees, never breaking from my body. The intense, searing white was quickly becoming all I could see. I slammed my eyes shut as best I could, but it did little help. I could turn my head the closer I got and felt my heart ruptured when next to me I saw Danny, drifting towards the same fate I was. There was tears streaming down her paralyzed face. Everything went black like the flip of a light switch. I woke up hard and I woke up fast, like I was dropped into bed from the ceiling. I arose feeling nauseous and shitty. I tried to rub the sleep from my eyes and felt my face, tight and hot. This time I instantly knew what I was feeling. I sprinted to the bathroom mirror. I saw my red face and shoulders, shiny and peeling. It hurt. I could see the beds behind me in the mirror. Danny wasn't in either of them. My confusion pivoted to panic. She wasn't in the room. She wasn't in the fucking room. I searched and scrambled outside. I threw up. I cried. She wouldn't just leave me. She wouldn't. The car was still parked outside. Her keys and wallet were still in the locked room. Even her shoes were still there. She was gone. I threw up and cried throughout the entire questioning process with the police. The officers who took my statements were getting sick and nauseous as the hours went on. Some of them were gagging. They questioned all two of the employees that worked the motel that night. Neither of them was taken serious. I don't know what they said. I only heard that all the electronics went out at the same moment and that one of them was passed out at the time. She was filed as missing, and they brushed their hands off the situation. I guess they have a lot of missing persons reports this time of year, and are going to do everything within our power to find your friend. They pinned her picture onto a giant board that hung on the wall. She was surrounded by hundreds of other missing men, women and children. My vision zoomed out, and her face became a drop in an ocean of faces. All of them had vanished without a trace, never to be seen again. My dad drove down the last few hours we had to make to escort me home. Dale stayed home with Mom and the family. The drive back in Dad's truck was long and silent. I didn't have any words, only sadness and worry. My dad did his best to comfort me. We made it back to the ranch a day late. Alondra was a faith healer, and like every single one of her kind, she was a complete and total fraud. She came from a long line of faith healers, those who would go town to town, set up a revival tent, preach a sermon, and then heal those who came forth, all in the name of God and money. I worked for Alondra as part of her traveling revival show. My job was to vet audience members before the show began, helping decide which of them would be invited on stage to have hands laid upon them and supposedly be healed. I'd start my day in the parking lot, which was often just a field on the outskirts of whatever town we were visiting. I'd watch intently as people got out of their cars and headed toward the revival tent. Typically, I'd keep an eye out for people who used a wheelchair to get around, but still had the ability to walk short distances. I'd spot them right away. The passenger door of their car would pop open, they'd slowly get out, and then shuffle over to the trunk of the car, where their companion would pull out their wheelchair and guide them into a seated position. These were the people who'd get invited on stage to be healed. I'd follow behind them and covertly listen into their conversations so that I could pick up some useful tidbits of information, like their names. I'd take note of where they sat, and then pass all that information on to our production crew. Sometimes I'd see people in wheelchairs who couldn't walk even a little bit. There was no chance in hell they'd be invited up to the stage. After all, God will only heal those who can meet him halfway. Now, just so you have an understanding of how everything worked, let me run you through a typical revival. Start by imagining this. It's revival day and the show is beginning. Alondra starts her sermon by spouting off whatever biblical nonsense she's decided to talk about that day. It usually centers around Jesus healing the faithful, but sometimes it's completely random. Just Bible quotes that Alondra selected from some deep recess of her memory. While she's busy telling lies to the believers, the crew coordinates which audience members are going to be invited on stage. I key my radio and speak to Kyle, our production supervisor. "The guy in the left section wearing a blue shirt and Red Angels ball cap," I say. "He's in a wheelchair, but I saw him take some steps. He should go first. His name's Lawrence. The wife is Shelley." Kyle listens intently as I tell him about Lawrence and the others I vetted. Alondra then brings the sermon back into focus by telling the crowd that she herself has been selected by Jesus Christ to carry out his work in the heartland of America. She takes a big dramatic pause and looks out to the expectant crowd, some of whom want to be healed, and some who just want to see God's hand in action. She clears her throat and points her hands at the audience. "God is speaking to me right now," she says. "He's telling me there's someone here who's been in a lot of pain lately. Someone who prays every day that he'll be able to get up out of his wheelchair and dance with his wife once again." She turns and looks directly at our mark. "Lawrence, yes, you in the blue shirt. Christ is calling you. Come on up here with your beautiful wife Shelley." Lawrence and Shelley, faces full of happy tears, make their way to the front. Alondra tells them how special they are, how she knows that Lawrence has been dreaming about the day when he can stand and hold his wife close once again. She lays a hand on Lawrence's forehead and commands him to be healed. Immediately, two of our stagehands run forward and lift him from his chair. Lawrence, adrenaline pulsing through his veins, puts his legs down and stands up. Whatever pain he may be feeling in his legs is eclipsed by the applause from the crowd and a desire to not piss off Jesus. He takes a step, then another. His wife reaches into her purse and puts all her money in a nearby donation bin. Others in the crowd do the same as Lawrence spins in a circle and smiles. The next person is called to the stage and the healing continues. And that's how it went. Town to town, dollar to dollar. We mostly healed people in wheelchairs, but we would also heal those who suffered from any sort of chronic pain, and even cancer patients. It was by far the best paying job I ever had, and I grew close to everyone in the crew. We were a den of thieves and liars, but we were honest and noble amongst each other. Alondra was middle-aged and very charismatic, both on stage and off. She could preach a sermon about watching paint dry, and it would somehow still be the best sermon you ever heard. Her father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had all been faith healers. It was how she was raised, and she intrinsically knew what everyone around her needed to hear. She dominated any conversation she was part of, but she was always so interesting that nobody minded. When she wasn't preaching, she spoke about hockey, purses, horses, TV shows, and pretty much anything except God and Jesus. Kyle, our production supervisor, had once been a firm believer in Christ. Initially, he'd joined up with Alondra under the belief that her powers were truly God-given and not the result of trickery and deception. He was quickly disappointed, but soon found solace within the fat wads of cash he was making. During his first few years, he rationalized his actions by claiming that he'd donate his money to charity, but after a while he stopped saying that. There were 10 of us in total who ran the show. I joined the crew knowing from the beginning that it was all a scam, but separating the foolish from their money didn't bother me one bit. The beginning of the end came one morning when Alondra walked out of her trailer and addressed the rest of us. "I'm going to heal an amputee," she said matter-of-factly. We laughed. "No, I'm serious," she said. "Jesus came to me in a dream last night. He told me how to do it." The rest of that day, all she could talk about was how Jesus had spoken to her and that she'd never experienced anything like it before. "He glowed," she recalled. "I've never felt so at peace than when he was with me. I was sitting at a large table with him. And then, suddenly, there were 8 of him, and they all spoke in unison, telling me exactly what I need to know. It was weird. I mean, here was a woman who never discussed God or Jesus unless she was trying to con people out of their money, and all of a sudden, in the most earnest way, she was telling us how great Jesus was, and that she had dreamed about 8 copies of him. We kept trying to laugh it off, but that only made her more insistent that she had a newly divine purpose. At that point, we had a couple more days before our next revival. We were camped outside some podunk town, still setting up our tent and equipment. Alondra pulled me aside and spoke to me. "I need you to go to the ocean and get some seaweed, burn it on the sand, and then bring the ash back to me." "What?" I said. "I need ash from seaweed. The seaweed needs to be burned on the sand. It can't be done any place else, and it must be done today. That's what Jesus told me." I protested. "Are you insane? Even if I wanted to, we're 200 miles from the ocean." "We have time," she said, holding out the key to her Mercedes. "Take my car." "Can't you go?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I have to stay here and meditate." "Since when do you meditate?" I asked. She ignored my question and forced the car key into my hand and smiled. "Make sure you do it right. If you don't follow the directions exactly, I'll know." She turned around and walked back to her trailer. I quickly found Kyle, who was helping set up the tent. "Alondra is acting really weird," I said. "Gee, you think?" Kyle replied. "She's making me drive to the ocean and bring back some seaweed." "What?" Kyle said as he took off his hat and scratched his head in confusion. "There's too much work here." "Why don't you go speak to her?" I asked. "Maybe you can talk some sense into her." "I'll be right back." Kyle stormed off to her trailer, but not more than 5 minutes later he returned. He was clearly distressed. "Maybe you should just go do it," he said with shaky hands. "I don't think I can reason with her right now." I looked down at the car key in my hand. "Really? Think of it as a day at the beach. At least it gets you out of helping with the setup," he said. I clamped my hand around the key while pondering my options. There's no way I'm going to drive 200 miles to the ocean. Maybe I'll just go into town and catch a couple of movies. Alondra won't know the difference, and I'll just pick up some ashes from that campsite over the hill. Kyle glanced over at Alondra's trailer and shook his head, almost like he was in fear of her. "No, she'll know if you don't do it right." "Man, what did she say to you?" I asked. "It's not really what she said. It's how she said it," he replied. "She told me to tell you to do as she asked, but the way she spoke her words..." He trailed off for a moment. "It just made me scared. I can't really explain it." I rolled my eyes, but I knew there was no more discussion to be had. Anyway, Alondra had always paid me well and treated me like family. I supposed it wouldn't kill me to do what she asked. I got into her car and drove off, giving Kyle a wave of my hand as I passed him. Once I hit the open highway, I floored the gas pedal and watched the scenery zip by. It took me less than 3 hours to get to the coast. As I passed through a small beach town, I spotted a touristy general store. I knew that if I was going to burn seaweed on the beach, I'd need a few supplies. I pulled in and bought a lighter, a flat metal pan to collect the ash, and a plastic container to hold the ash for the drive home. By that point, I was already within walking distance of the coast, so I darted across the coastal highway and made my way to the sand. It was an overcast, off-season day, so I had the beach pretty much to myself. After a few minutes of walking along the coastline, I saw a floating patch of seaweed not too far from the shore. I removed my shoes and socks and waded into the ocean. When I got to the patch, I saw little sea critters who'd been using the patch as a hideaway flitter off into the green-hued water. I grabbed a mass of seaweed and tried to tear off a chunk. When that proved difficult, I got out my pocket knife and cut off a large piece, and then returned to the sand. Like any regular, sane person, I'd never tried to burn seaweed before, so I wasn't exactly sure how it should be done. After trying a few different things, what I found worked best was simply holding the seaweed in one hand and the flaming lighter in the other, and then putting the two together to let the seaweed cook. The seaweed was wet, obviously, so it took a while for all the water to boil off. As the seaweed began to darken and bubble, the most ungodly smell hit me. Now, I wasn't expecting it to smell good. Seaweed never does, but I guess I was at least expecting it to smell like the ocean. Instead, the odor could only be described as a combination of dog crap and burning plastic. It was so awful that after a while, it caused a sense of dread to form in the pit of my stomach, as if I was doing something so unnatural that the earth itself was telling me to stop. Nonetheless, I pressed on, mostly because I'd already gone so far that I was determined to see it through. A massive headache spread from my left temple to my right temple, which I tried my best to ignore. When the seaweed finally started to turn to ash, which took a long time, by the way, I let it fall into my pan and then used my pocket knife to scrape it into the plastic container. I discarded the pan and lighter on the sand, and after a moment of thought, I discarded my pocket knife too. It was a contaminated item, and I didn't want it any longer. I rinsed my hands off in the ocean for a good long minute, and then walked back to Alondra's Mercedes. I tossed the container of ash in the trunk and headed back, fighting off the throbbing headache and trying to focus on my long drive. I drove much slower than before, and I returned well after dark, when everyone else was asleep. I stumbled into my trailer, trying hard not to wake my roomies, and collapsed onto my bed. I awoke the next morning feeling much better. I retrieved the container of ash and gave it to Alondra, who looked exceedingly pleased. She opened the container and rubbed the tip of her finger in the ash. "Thank you, bringer of ash," she said as she grazed her ashy finger against my forehead, leaving a small mark in its wake. "You will be rewarded." She acted as if there was no foul smell at all as she put the cap back on the container, but I almost vomited. Once she was out of sight, I ran to look for some water to rinse the ash from my forehead. Not only did it stink, but it also caused a burning sensation. I found a 10-gallon water cooler and pretty much used all of it to wash my head. There was still a red mark where the ash had been, but otherwise I seemed okay. Alondra kept to herself the rest of that day, while I focused on my work, doing my best to avoid thinking about the task I'd performed. When I ran into Kyle, it seemed that he was in a better mood, after having been spooked by Alondra the day before. Our revival was scheduled for a day later, and while Kyle truthfully assured Alondra that he'd found an amputee for her to heal, he separately told all of us to play it like any regular revival. "We'll do the wheelchair people first, and maybe a couple of cancer patients," he told us. "I've arranged for an amputee to be in the audience, so once the money is collected, he can go up there and Alondra can do whatever it is she thinks she's going to do." He glanced over his shoulder to make sure Alondra wasn't looking. "I swear, if she wasn't the boss..." He trailed off before telling us to get to work. The next day, as the fools from the town began to show up, we assumed our roles. I blended into the crowd and spied on those who were arriving, selecting targets and gathering information. Everything went as expected, right up until the point that the show began. Alondra's sermon was different this time. Instead of talking about Jesus healing lepers, or sick servants, or friends' mothers, she seemed indignant, maybe even furious. She stayed laser-focused, talking angrily about the wages of sin and other bullcrap like that. As she ended her sermon, and the show began to segue over to the healing, Kyle came over the radio to give Alondra her first patient. Fat man with the blue shirt and long moustache, second row, name's Joe. Alondra nonchalantly reached up and removed her tiny earpiece, letting it fall to the stage floor. She'd just disconnected herself from the rest of us. I could hear Kyle react. "Alondra! Alondra, what are you doing?" But of course, she could no longer hear him. Alondra looked out to the audience and then pointed directly to Kyle's planted amputee. "You! The Lord is calling you up here!" Our lighting tech quickly adjusted to the unexpected change in the show and re-aimed the spotlight at the man with only one arm. I heard Kyle's voice coming through the radio again. "Oh, crap!" We all looked at each other uneasily as the man rose from his chair and approached Alondra. I'm not sure where Kyle found this guy, but it soon became apparent that he hadn't done a very good job vetting him. The guy was gruff-looking dude. Alondra greeted him with the biggest smile I'd ever seen. "Please, tell us your name." "Henry Woodruff," the man said curtly. "And what brings you to seek out the Lord today?" Apparently, nobody'd mentioned to Henry that he was supposed to be playing the role of a downtrodden, yet hopeful and God-fearing man who only wanted to be healed. "I was paid $100 to show up here." Alondra wasn't bothered by the man's tone at all. "And please tell us what led to your tragic situation." Henry looked down at the shoulder that had once held his arm. "Oh, you mean this unfortunate bit of business right here? Car accident, drunk driver." "And have you found it in your heart to forgive this drunk driver?" Alondra asked. Henry chuckled. "Yeah, I forgive him every time I see him in the mirror." Alondra didn't miss a beat. "Oh, so you were the drunk driver?" Henry shrugged his shoulders. "It happens, you know." "Well, Henry, the Lord forgives and heals all those who seek it, and the Lord will heal you here today." "Hey, me and the Lord will be square as long as I get my $100, he replied. The crowd was becoming noticeably uneasy as they shifted in their seats and muttered to themselves about the uncomfortable interaction happening on the stage. I took my earpiece out just so I didn't have to listen to all the cuss words Kyle was spitting out. Alondra reached for the container of ash that I'd provided her. The ushers, who normally helped to lift the healed from their wheelchairs, glanced at one another from the sidelines, not knowing exactly what their role was going to be in this healing. "Henry," Alondra said as she reached for his sleeve, "may I see the spot where your arm was?" Henry grunted his permission as Alondra pushed up the loose sleeve. She looked out to the audience. Through the power of belief and prayer, this man will grow a new arm. The audience gasped and leaned forward in their seats. Alondra opened the container, dipped 2 fingers in the ash, and smeared it all over Henry's stub. Henry wrinkled his nose as the smell hit him, and seconds later, the crowd began muttering their disdain over the smell too. I could tell from the look on Henry's face that he couldn't wait to collect his $100 and then get the heck out of there. Alondra addressed one of the ushers. "Could you please hand me that prayer cloth over there?" The usher looked around and saw the cloth Alondra was referring to. He quickly retrieved it and brought it to her. She wrapped the cloth around the ash and held it in place. "Henry, do you feel the power of the Lord coursing through you?" Henry's face turned pale. "It burns!" he shouted as he reflexively pulled away from her. Again, not missing a beat, Alondra removed the cloth from the retreating Henry and looked to the crowd. "Now witness the power of the Lord!" All of a sudden, Henry gave an excited yelp. "What the hell?" he said as he glanced down at his shoulder. I didn't have a good vantage point, but from what I could tell, there seemed to be something erupting from Henry's stump. It was small at first, maybe the size of a finger, but quickly and miraculously it grew in length and thickness. It was a green, wiggling appendage that made me feel nauseous just looking at it. After half a minute it must have been the size of an elephant's trunk, but even then, its growth showed no signs of slowing. Henry, who to that point had been shocked into silence while his new arm grew, let out the most awful scream I'd ever heard. The appendage began flailing around wildly, and by the wild expression on Henry's face, it was obvious he had no control over its movements. Upon hearing the scream, Alondra seemed to snap out of whatever holy fugue she'd been stuck in. For just a moment, she had a wide-eyed expression on her face before she began to back away. The appendage, which by then was about 10 feet long, could only be described as something that looked like a tentacle from a massive octopus. At first it flailed around randomly along the stage, its movements like an out-of-control fire hose fishtailing wildly on the floor. But suddenly, the movements of the tentacle seemed to become purposeful as it reached its full size. As Alondra continued to back away, the tentacle reached out and swept her feet from under her, causing her to land on her back. At that point, Kyle came running onto the stage, reaching out to Alondra to try and help her up. The tentacle shot out and wrapped itself around his neck before he could even get to her, making several loops and then squeezing tight. His face instantly turned purple as he gasped for breath and clawed helplessly at the tentacle, trying to free himself. Henry looked to be in a panic, still having no control over what was happening with his newly sprouted appendage. He reached across his chest with his other arm and began striking at it in a vain attempt to wrest some sort of control over what was happening to his body, but his efforts were useless. Alondra finally found enough wherewithal to right herself. Her legs wobbled as she stood up and tried to move away. The tentacle gave one last jerk around Kyle's neck. Even from my distant vantage point, I could hear his neck snap. The tentacle tossed his ragdoll body toward the fleeing crowd, where it crashed into some empty folding chairs that had held spectators only moments before. The tentacle whipped across the stage and managed to grab onto Alondra right before she almost managed to get away. It wrapped itself around her waist and lifted her up. Amidst the screaming and panic of the audience, I locked eyes with Alondra as she was held high up in the air. She knew she was moments from death. Now, one thing you need to know about Alondra is that despite her deceitful professional life, to me, she was like a big sister, den mother, and good friend, all rolled into one. She'd taken me in and gave me purpose when nobody else had. At that point, I did what was perhaps the first selfless act in my life. I ran toward the stage to try and help her. I couldn't get there fast enough, though. The tentacle slammed Alondra to the floor face first. It raised her up again as I ran on stage and jumped onto the thrashing tentacle, trying to use my weight to halt its movements, or at least slow them down. A stream of blood was gushing from Alondra's nose, and most of her front teeth had been knocked out. I had a hard time holding onto the slick tentacle and ended up slipping off and tumbling to the stage floor. The tentacle slammed Alondra to the ground a second time, even harder than the first. Then, it raised her up one last time, as if it was displaying its trophy to the world. Alondra's final punishment came as the tentacle smashed her into the floor with so much force that the entire stage nearly collapsed from the impact. It released her limp body and turned toward me. I'd already righted myself and had nearly moved out of its reach when I felt it wrap around my ankle. Its grasp felt like a vice clamping around my joint, and I could feel my bones crack under the stress. The only thing that saved me is that Barry, one of our production assistants, came running in with an axe and began hacking at the tentacle. He landed one good blow, cutting deep into the appendage, but he didn't get a chance to land a second one. As the tentacle released its grip from my ankle and reached out toward him, I took the opportunity to start crawling off the stage. But from the corner of my eye I saw that, rather than toy with Barry, the tentacle wasted no time and impaled him right through his abdomen, exiting out his backside. Barry had a look of surprise on his face as he dropped the axe to the floor. I kept crawling and managed to get myself off the stage. From what I could see of the audience, most of them had managed to flee, but at least 2 men had drawn guns and began firing once they had clear shots. Bang! The first shot hit Henry right in the kneecap, causing him to crumple to the floor. This seemed to have no effect on the tentacle, and it continued to wave Barry's impaled body around like it was a victory flag. Bang, bang. The next 2 shots hit the tentacle directly, causing it to pull out of Barry, who fell lifelessly to the floor. Bang. The 4th bullet sailed wide and struck another one of our production assistants who was behind the stage. He fell down face first. Bang. The 5th shot hit Henry right in the middle of his forehead, blasting out through the back of his skull and carrying some brain matter along with it. Henry slumped over but couldn't fall completely to the ground, with the tentacle acting like a kickstand that kept him propped up. The tentacle continued to flop around like a fish pulled from a pond. Another person, I don't even know who, ran up to the stage, grabbed the loose axe, and began hacking away at the tentacle, managing to sever it from Henry's body after many blows. Even then, it continued to twitch defiantly for another 10 minutes. Everything was a bloody mess. Barry, Alondra, Kyle, and Henry were not only dead, but also barely recognizable as human. Our other production assistant, the one who'd been shot, was also dead. Our audience went screaming to their homes, while at the same time, the police, fire department, and even state and federal agencies were summoned. But what sense could they make of the scene of carnage in front of them? In the end, the official government report and the mainstream news media called it a mass shooting, even though only 2 people were killed by bullets. The report made no mention of the 200 eyewitness testimonies that said an octopus tentacle had grown from Henry's stump, only that a tentacle had been found at the scene, and that it must have been used in some sort of previously undocumented pseudo-Christian ritual. One of the popular tabloid newspapers of the time, which had a reputation for distasteful gossip and sensational headlines, ran a fairly accurate article about the incident, but aside from that, everything seemed to get swept under the rug. Keep in mind, this was many years ago, before everyone carried a smartphone in their pocket, so there was never any video footage of the incident. I often think back to that day and try to figure out exactly what happened. The only conclusion I can come to is that if you piss off God long enough, he responds. I don't understand the meaning of Alondra's dream or why it flipped her so hard. I will say that I've become a better person. There's a scar on my forehead where Alondra wiped the ash. For years after the incident, whenever I thought about engaging in some sort of unethical behavior, the scar would start to tingle, and I'd think better of it. Today, I work an honest job, and I'm teaching my children the value of honest work as well. However, I can't go so far as to say that I've become religious, because no God that would kill my friends so mercilessly deserves my adulation. I understand some of you may feel otherwise, that maybe they deserved their fates, but your opinions are of no concern to me. Perhaps I just need more time. I never paid too much attention to the sermons that Alondra delivered. They were, after all, lies spewed out of the mouth of a master liar. Nonetheless, some of the verses stuck in my mind, and while I know many people find comfort in the Bible, one of the verses she used to preach will always leave me feeling a little uneasy. Friends, do not avenge yourselves. Instead, leave room for his wrath, for it is written, "Vengeance belongs to me. I will repay, says the Lord." Romans 12:19. The skeptical have asked of faith healers many times, why won't God heal an amputee? To that I say, God did. I took the night security job at Lakeside Carnival on a whim. It was an off-season position, meant to last only through the winter, while the park went through renovations and an equipment upgrade. Nothing fancy, but the pay wasn't bad for what seemed like a simple gig. Besides, I've always preferred night work, the quiet hours and the solitude. I'm not a people person. and the idea of roaming an empty theme park under the stars was oddly appealing. The park had been around for decades, tucked away on the edge of town near a small lake. It was the kind of place that was bursting with life in the summer and felt like a ghost town in the winter. Rides that would have been filled with screams and laughter stood silent, their bright colors dulled in the moonlight. The whole place had an eerie beauty to it at night, the way the roller coaster's tracks twisted up into the sky like skeletal hands reaching out for something. It felt still, like it was holding its breath. On my first night, I met Mr. Davidson, the park's manager. He was an older man, probably in his mid-60s, with greying hair and a face that looked worn from years of long shifts and the pressures of running the place. As he walked me around the empty park, showing me my route and the key locations, he spoke in a low, gruff voice that barely broke the silence. "Listen," he said, stopping near the carousel. "There are some things you need to keep in mind during your shifts here. This place isn't like the others. It's got a history. Some of it good, some of it not so much. Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." I chuckled, brushing it off. "Rules? Like don't ride the Ferris wheel alone or make sure the clowns don't escape?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he handed me a small, worn piece of paper, folded and creased like it had been opened and closed 100 times. Across the top, in faded ink, were the words, "Night Security Rules." Below, in the same old-fashioned script, a list of instructions. Night security rules. Never look directly at the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m. If you hear carnival music, follow it to the entrance and wait until it stops. Do not enter the funhouse alone. If someone dressed as a clown waves at you, turn around and walk away. The list seemed absurd, and I chuckled again, expecting him to say it was a joke. But when I looked up, Davidson's face was grim. He met my gaze, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something. Worry, fear. "Do not," he said, his voice low, "under any circumstances break these rules." I shrugged, feeling a strange discomfort settle in my stomach, but I nodded. "Sure thing. If it keeps the ghosts at bay, I'll do it." Davidson left me with a firm handshake and one final reminder to check the list whenever I felt uneasy. I watched him leave, his figure disappearing into the darkness beyond the park gates, and then I turned to look at the paper in my hand. The first rule felt innocuous enough. Never look directly at the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m. I glanced over at the carousel, a colorful fixture even in the dim light. The horses were lined up in silent parade, frozen in mid-gallop, their manes captured in a permanent wave. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I walked by, an effect that was eerie at night. But Davidson's warning lingered, and I tucked the list into my pocket, telling myself it was just some quirky attempt to add mystery to the place. The park was still and quiet, an unnatural silence that settled deep into the empty spaces between the rides and food stalls. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, towering above the park like a watchful eye. I felt a faint chill, and I told myself it was just the cool night air seeping through my jacket. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I began my rounds. The hours passed slowly. I wandered through the empty paths, the only sounds the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional creak of an old ride swaying in the wind. Around midnight, I found myself back near the carousel, and I paused, glancing at the clock on my phone. 12:15, the rules said not to look at it after 1 a.m., and I had no problem obeying that. I decided to keep moving, staying close to the edge of the park, where the woods crept up close to the fences. My mind started to wander, drawn to the oddities of the place, the aging rides, the faded posters, the way the park felt almost frozen in time. It was as if it had been waiting, holding on to its past, like a memory that refused to fade. At one point, I passed by the funhouse. In the day, it was bright and cheerful, with a cartoonish face painted above the entrance. But now, in the dim light, it looked different, almost sinister. The colors were faded, and the once smiling face seemed to have twisted into a leer. I felt an irrational urge to go inside, to walk through the twisting halls and see what lay at the end. But rule number 3 lingered in my mind. Do not enter the funhouse alone. I laughed to myself, dismissing the impulse. I was alone in a deserted theme park at night after all. Who wouldn't feel a little jumpy? As I continued my patrol, I caught sight of the clown statues scattered throughout the park. They were relics from the park's early days, dressed in garish, old-fashioned costumes and frozen in a perpetual wave or a cheerful grin. Something about them was unsettling, The way their painted smiles seemed a little too wide, a little too fixed. And that last rule, if someone dressed as a clown waves at you, turn around and walk away. It was ridiculous. Who would be dressed as a clown here, at this hour? I shook my head, dismissing the strange list once again. It was nothing more than a set of superstitions, an old security guard's joke left behind to spook the newbies. I told myself that over and over as I made my way back to the entrance. As I stood there, taking in the quiet, a faint sound drifted through the air, the distant tinkling notes of carnival music. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. It was faint, almost like a memory, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the park. I reached for the list in my pocket, unfolding it with trembling fingers. Rule number 2, if you hear carnival music, follow it to the entrance and wait until it stops. The music was growing louder, filling the air with a tune that was both cheerful and haunting. I forced myself to move, to follow the path back to the entrance, my footsteps quick and uneven. The music continued, echoing through the empty park, a haunting melody that seemed to wrap around me, drawing me in. When I reached the entrance, I stopped, glancing around as the music continued to play, faint but persistent. I waited, my pulse quickening, until, finally, the music faded, trailing off into silence. I let out a shaky breath, glancing down at the list in my hand. The rules had seemed like nonsense at first, a silly joke meant to unsettle me. But now, standing alone in the dark, I wasn't so sure. Something about the park felt different, as if it had come alive, aware of my presence. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the park was watching me. By dawn, I'd almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been in my head, just nerves playing tricks on me. But that morning, lying in bed, the faint strains of carnival music still echoed in my mind. It was the kind of tune you couldn't forget, even if you wanted to. The notes lingered, twisting around in my head as I drifted off to sleep. The following night I returned to the park, a slight feeling of unease gnawing at me. I told myself it was nothing, that the music had probably come from a forgotten speaker or an automated system that turned on by accident. That's all it could have been. I repeated this in my mind as I went through my rounds, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The night was colder, a biting chill in the air that seemed to seep into my bones. I kept the list of rules in my pocket, my fingers brushing against the worn paper every so often, as though it could somehow protect me. I'd thought about ignoring the rules, maybe even testing them, but the memory of that music, the way it had wound its way through the empty park, held me back. As I passed the carousel, I glanced at the clock on my phone, 12:55, 5 minutes to go before the first rule would apply. A trickle of dread ran down my spine as I realized I didn't want to be anywhere near the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m. I turned away, deciding to circle around the park to give the carousel a wide berth. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At exactly 1 o'clock, I heard a faint sound, just a soft whir, like gears beginning to turn. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced back, half expecting to see the carousel starting up on its own. But the horses stood still, frozen in mid-gallop, their glassy eyes staring blankly out into the night. I tried to look away, to continue on my path, but my gaze was drawn to them, an irresistible urge to look directly at the carousel, to confront whatever was happening. I took a step closer, the rules slipping from my mind as the whirring sound grew louder. The air felt heavier, pressing down on me, filling my ears with a low hum that made it hard to think. My vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt slightly as I stepped closer to the carousel, drawn to it despite myself. Just as I reached the edge of the platform, my phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the spell. I jolted, pulling myself back, and quickly turned away, my heart racing. I walked briskly toward the other side of the park, forcing myself to ignore the carousel, even as the whirring sound faded into silence. I didn't dare look back. My phone buzzed again, a message lighting up the screen. It was from Davidson, the park manager. Follow the rules. Well, that was all it said, just those 3 words. I felt a chill run through me. I hadn't told Davidson about my shift or that I'd even considered testing the rules. How could he have known? I shoved my phone back into my pocket, my hand trembling slightly, and continued my rounds, keeping my gaze firmly fixed ahead. The air felt wrong as I moved through the park, the silence more oppressive than ever. It was as though the rides themselves were watching, waiting for something to happen. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the night sky, its empty seats swaying gently in the wind. I could almost hear it creak, a soft groan that sounded unnervingly like a sigh. Just after 2 a.m., I passed by the funhouse. The entrance was still, the cartoonish face painted above the doorway twisted into a smile that now looked sinister in the dark. The door creaked slightly in the breeze, swinging open just a crack, as if inviting me inside. I felt a strange urge to enter, to walk through the dimly lit halls and see what lay at the end, but the rule echoed in my mind. Do not enter the funhouse alone. I shuddered, turning away, forcing myself to walk back toward the main path. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each step feeling heavier, as though the ground itself was dragging me down. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the entrance, watching me leave, but there was nothing, just the gaping entrance of the funhouse, its twisted grin mocking me. The silence pressed in around me as I continued my rounds, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I thought about Davidson's message, the way he'd known exactly what I'd been doing, as though he were watching from somewhere beyond the park's gates. I glanced at my phone again, almost expecting another message, but the screen was dark. As the clock neared 3 a.m., I returned to the entrance, eager to finish my shift. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Just as I was about to settle back into my chair, a faint sound drifted through the air, the distant strains of carnival music. My blood ran cold, and I reached for the list in my pocket, unfolding it with trembling fingers. Rule number 2, if you hear carnival music, follow it to the entrance and wait until it stops. I forced myself to stay calm, to follow the instructions, even as the music grew louder, filling the air with a haunting tune. The melody was slow, almost mournful, each note hanging in the air before fading into silence. I stood there, listening, my pulse racing as the music echoed through the empty park, a sound that didn't belong. I glanced around, expecting to see lights flickering on, the rides springing to life in some nightmarish display. But the park remained dark, the rides still, and the only movement was the gentle sway of the Ferris wheel in the distance. The music continued, winding its way through the air, a melody that felt strangely familiar, as though I'd heard it before, long ago. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down, half expecting another message from Davidson, but the screen was blank, and when I looked up, the music had stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy stillness that pressed down on me, filling my ears with a ringing that wouldn't fade. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding as the reality of the rules settled over me. They weren't just guidelines, they were warnings, boundaries meant to keep me safe from whatever lurked in the shadows of Lakeside Carnival. I glanced around, my gaze sweeping over the darkened rides, the empty stalls, the rows of clown statues frozen in perpetual cheer. For the first time, I felt as though the park itself were alive, aware of my presence, watching me from every corner, every shadow. Just then, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, my heart racing, but saw nothing. The shadows seemed to shift, pooling in strange shapes that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me, but the sense of unease grew stronger, a knot of dread settling in my stomach. The sound of gravel crunching broke the silence, and I froze. Someone, or something, was moving toward me, footsteps echoing in the stillness. I gripped my flashlight, the beam wavering slightly as I pointed it toward the source of the sound, but the footsteps stopped, and the darkness swallowed whatever had been there. A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced back at the entrance, suddenly desperate to leave, to escape the strange pull of the park. But my shift wasn't over, and I knew I couldn't leave until dawn. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and continued my rounds, forcing myself to ignore the shadows that seemed to close in around me. The rules felt heavier now, their words echoing in my mind, a reminder that there were forces at work in the park that I couldn't understand. I could feel their presence, lurking in the darkness. waiting for me to make a mistake, and as I walked, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't alone. The weight of the silence bore down on me as I made my way through the park. The rides loomed like towering skeletons, their frames twisted and shadowed, each one standing as a silent witness to the strange occurrences of the night. Despite my efforts to stay calm, an unsettling realization settled over me. This place was watching, waiting, and somehow it was aware of my every move. As I continued my patrol, a strange compulsion grew within me, a pull I couldn't resist. It was almost as if the park itself were guiding me, leading me down winding paths, past the silent games booths and empty snack stands. The familiar layout felt distorted, the paths stretching longer, twisting in ways I couldn't quite remember. I wanted to turn back, to escape the maze of shadows, but something drove me forward, an unspoken demand whispering at the edges of my mind. The pull grew stronger as I approached the carousel, and before I knew it, I was standing just a few feet away, drawn by a force I couldn't understand. The horses stood in perfect stillness, their glassy eyes fixed on me, their once playful expressions frozen in something that now felt like malice. I swallowed hard, remembering the first rule: never look directly at the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m. But it was already too late. A flicker of light caught my eye, and I turned to see the carousel coming to life. The faint whir of gears filled the air, followed by the slow creak of metal as the platform began to rotate, each horse bobbing up and down in a slow, ghostly parade. The music started softly, just a whisper of a tune, but it grew louder, filling the air with a melody that was both haunting and strangely familiar. I tried to look away, but my gaze was locked on the carousel, trapped in the rhythmic rise and fall of the horses. My pulse quickened, and I felt a strange, creeping fear settle over me, an understanding that I was witnessing something forbidden, something I shouldn't have seen. I wanted to turn and run, to escape the pull of the music and the carousel, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. Suddenly, I saw something move between the horses. A figure, shadowed and indistinct, darting in and out of sight as the platform spun. I blinked, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, but the figure remained, moving with the same slow, steady rhythm as the horses. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was watching me, its gaze piercing through the darkness. The figure stepped closer, slipping between the horses with an ease that defied logic. I caught glimpses of a face, a pale, painted smile, eyes dark and hollow, a hint of red around the lips. The makeup was smudged, the features distorted, twisted into a grin that was too wide, too empty. A clown. My heart raced as I remembered the last rule: if someone dressed as a clown waves at you, turn around and walk away. But I couldn't move. The clown stepped forward, one hand raised in a slow, deliberate wave, its smile widening, stretching impossibly across its face. I took a step back, my pulse pounding, but the clown kept coming, weaving between the horses as it closed the distance. The carousel picked up speed, the horses bobbing faster, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. The music grew louder, the notes blurring into a discordant melody that filled my head, drowning out my thoughts. "Stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible, swallowed by the relentless tune. "Please, just stop." The clown paused, its gaze locked on mine, and for a brief moment, I thought it would listen, that it would stop. But then it moved again, its movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. It was close now, just a few feet away, its hand still raised in that mocking wave, its painted smile stretched into a leer. I stumbled backward, the weight of the fear pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The clown's eyes were dark, empty, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, piercing through me. I tried to look away, to break the spell, but my gaze was locked on its face, trapped in the horrible, distorted grin. "Why are you here?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The clown tilted its head, as if considering my question, its smile widening. It raised a hand, pointing at me, its finger held steady, accusing, and then it spoke, its voice soft, a whisper that seemed to echo in the empty park. "You broke the rules." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I took another step back, my heart pounding. The clown's gaze held mine, unblinking, its finger still pointing, accusing. The carousel spun faster, the music building to a feverish pitch, filling the air with a maddening, endless tune. The horses' eyes seemed to gleam, their mouths twisted into snarls, their glassy gazes fixed on me. I turned and ran, the sound of the music chasing me, echoing through the empty park. My footsteps pounded against the ground, the cold night air stinging my lungs as I raced toward the entrance. But no matter how fast I ran, the music followed, a relentless tune that filled my ears, drowning out everything else. I glanced back just for a moment and saw the clown standing at the edge of the carousel, watching me with that same mocking smile. Its hand was still raised, waving slowly, its painted eyes glinting in the dark. I tore my gaze away, focusing on the path ahead, desperate to escape the park's grip. The exit was just ahead, the gates looming like a dark silhouette against the night sky. I pushed myself harder, every muscle straining as I closed the distance, but just as I reached the entrance, the music stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, a heavy, oppressive quiet that pressed down on me, filling the space where the music had been. I stopped, gasping for breath, my eyes scanning the darkness. The park was still, the rides frozen in mid-motion, their frames shrouded in shadow. I took a step forward, and then another, my gaze fixed on the gate. But as I reached the exit, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned, my heart skipping a beat, and saw a figure standing just a few feet away, half hidden in the shadows. It was a clown, its face painted in the same twisted smile, its eyes dark and empty. It raised a hand, waving slowly, its grin widening as it stepped closer. "No," I whispered, shaking my head, backing away. "No, this isn't real." The clown took another step, its gaze locked on mine, its smile frozen, unchanging. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing, the weight of the silence pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The park was watching, waiting, its presence filling the air with a palpable sense of anticipation. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the silence. The image of the clown's grin burned into my mind. The park seemed to twist around me, the paths stretching longer, winding in strange, impossible directions. I ran past the carousel, the Ferris wheel, the funhouse, each one looming like a silent sentinel, watching me with cold, unblinking eyes. As I stumbled past the funhouse, I felt the urge to look inside, to confront whatever was waiting there. But the memory of the rules held me back, a faint reminder that there were boundaries, lines I couldn't cross. The laughter started softly, just a faint echo in the distance, but it grew louder, filling the air with a hollow, mocking sound. I turned, my gaze darting through the darkness, but there was no one there, just the empty park, silent and waiting. The laughter grew, blending with the distant strains of carnival music, a sound that twisted and distorted, filling my mind with a creeping dread. I ran faster, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself toward the exit. Just as I reached the gates, a hand grabbed my shoulder, pulling me back. I turned, heart racing, and found myself face to face with the clown, its painted smile stretching impossibly wide, its eyes gleaming with a cold, unfeeling light. "You broke the rules," it whispered, its voice soft, a hiss that cut through the silence. I screamed, jerking away, and stumbled through the gates, the cold night air washing over me like a wave. I ran, not stopping until I was far from the park, the sound of the music and laughter fading into the distance. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. The memory of the clown's smile burned into my mind. The park gates swung shut behind me with a creak that seemed to echo through the empty streets. I kept running until the lights of the park had faded into the distance, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind reeling with images of the night. But even as I slowed to a walk, the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight, remained. I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see the painted face of the clown in the shadows, but the streets were empty. By the time I reached my apartment, the night was beginning to fade, a pale grey light touching the horizon. I stumbled inside, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me, as if that simple barrier could protect me from whatever had lingered in the park. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd left the horrors behind, but an uneasy feeling settled in my chest, a heaviness that I couldn't shake. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clown's face, its wide grin and hollow eyes watching me with a gaze that felt disturbingly real. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. The rules, the music, the carousel, each one a reminder that there was something in the park that defied understanding. The park had felt alive, aware, as though it were playing with me, testing the limits of my fear. The next morning, I called the park's main office, hoping to reach Davidson, to tell him I couldn't return, that I was done. But when the receptionist picked up, her voice calm and detached, she told me there was no one named Davidson working there. I insisted, explaining that he was the manager, that he'd hired me just a few days ago, but she only repeated herself, her tone growing colder, more distant. I hung up, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. Davidson, the rules, the entire night, all of it felt like a dream, a memory slipping through my fingers. I searched my pockets for the list, the rules I'd carried with me through the night. But my pockets were empty. The paper was gone, as though it had never existed. The days passed slowly, each one bleeding into the next. I stopped sleeping, the memories of the night filling my thoughts with a persistent, creeping unease. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow held a threat. At night, I would catch faint strains of carnival music drifting through the air, a haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere. I would sit up, listening, my heart racing, waiting for the music to fade, but the tune lingered, filling the silence with a hollow, mocking sound. And then, one night, I heard it. The soft, rhythmic tapping, the same sound that had followed me through the park. I froze, my heart pounding, as the tapping grew louder, closer, until it was just outside my window. I held my breath, the weight of the silence pressing down on me, the memories of the clown's painted smile filling my mind. Slowly I turned, my gaze drifting to the window, where the glass reflected a distorted version of my room. For a moment, I saw nothing, just my own face staring back at me, wide-eyed and pale. But then, in the reflection, a figure appeared, standing just behind me, half hidden in shadow. The face was painted in a wide grin, eyes dark and hollow, one hand raised in a slow, deliberate wave. I turned, my pulse racing, but the room was empty. The image faded, leaving only the faint strains of carnival music, a melody that lingered long after the room had fallen silent.